Chapter 1. Nabila traced the handwritten recipe page at the library desk, her fingertip pausing on the note about cardamom. The ink had faded to a soft brown, the loops and tails of each letter blurred by time and handling, yet the instruction to layer the spice 3 times still held clear. Dust motes drifted through the weak light from the high window, settling on the scarred oak surface where generations of readers had left their marks. She lifted the page closer, angling it toward the faint illumination, and studied the creases where someone long ago had folded it into quarters. This was not a culinary curiosity. This was the only thing she had left of her grandmother, a woman who had disappeared into the fog of a political purge decades ago, leaving behind nothing but a handful of scattered letters and this single, cryptic recipe. For years, Nabila had lived with a hollow space in her chest, a silence where a family history should have been. To recreate this cake was not to bake, it was to exhume. It was a desperate attempt to taste a memory she had never been allowed to form, to find a sensory bridge to a woman who had been erased from every official record. As she shifted the page, a sliver of parchment caught the light, a narrow strip of paper tucked into the binding of the recipe folder, nearly invisible. Nabila pulled it free. It wasn't a recipe. It was a handwritten marginalia, a frantic scrawl that differed from the elegant script of the cake instructions. The boundary of the East Grove is not where the fence stands. The true deed is baked into the tradition. Look to the layers. Nabila felt a sudden, sharp prickle of electricity at the base of her neck, a visceral jolt that made her breath hitch. The East Grove was the heart of the village's remaining commons, the very land currently being contested by the municipal council. She looked back at the recipe. For years she had viewed this as a personal quest for closure, a way to connect with a lost relative through flavor. But the note transformed the cardamom layers into something far more dangerous, a map, a code, or a legal claim hidden in plain sight. If the tradition mentioned here was the cake itself, then the recipe wasn't just a guide for a dessert, it was a piece of evidence that could stop the demolition of the village's soul. She gathered her things, sliding the recipe and the cryptic note between the notebook's covers. Her hands were shaking, a fine tremor she couldn't suppress. She left the desk, the library's heavy door closing behind her with a soft thud that echoed down the corridor like a gavel. Outside, the lane curved toward the bakery, its cobbles uneven under her shoes. Each step sent a vibration up through her soles, matching the hammering of her heart against her ribs. Her fingers tightened on the notebook edge, the leather cover pressing into her palm until it left a deep, red indentation. Warm sugar drifted out from the open vent above the threshold. Nabila slowed. The scent settled around her shoulders, carrying notes of brown butter and toasted grain, threaded with something sharper, the faint bite of citrus zest. She stood there, frozen, until the bell above the door jingled as someone exited, releasing a brief gust of warmer air. The street noise behind her faded, leaving only the low hum of ovens and the faint scrape of metal trays. Inside, Bahram rolled dough across the wide table. Flour coated his forearms to the elbows, dusting the dark hair there and settling into the creases of his knuckles. He glanced up at the sound of the bell and offered a brief nod, his eyes meeting hers for half a second longer than necessary before dropping back to the work. Back again for the cardamom layers, or just passing? His voice carried a dry, skeptical edge. He didn't stop the rhythmic press of his palms into the dough. I hope you've moved past the experimental phase, Nabila. Baking isn't a chemistry project where you can just guess the variables. It requires a level of precision I suspect you're still treating as a suggestion. Nabila stayed near the counter, the friction of his tone sparking a sudden hot defensiveness. Her throat tightened, making it difficult to swallow. She wasn't just experimenting, she was hunting for a ghost. She watched the dough stretch under his hands, the rhythmic press and turn, and wondered how many mornings he had spent like this, guarding a tradition he likely took for granted while she was fighting to reclaim hers. The silence stretched, thick with a professional tension. The clash between his lifelong mastery and her academic, desperate precision. Bahram dusted more flour across the surface, his movements sharp, almost aggressive. The last batch stuck because someone forgot the bench scraper. Not naming names, but the floor paid for it. He kept his tone even, the humor dry and low, his eyes flicking once to her notebook. If you're going to insist on following a recipe that's half-fated and likely incorrect, you're just wasting my flour and my time. Nabila stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly but gaining a trace of urgency. She didn't tell him about the note, not yet, but she spoke of the handwriting, the way the faded script seemed to carry instructions beyond simple measurement. She told him it was her grandmother's, her voice cracking on the word. Bahram listened without interrupting, the rolling pin pausing mid-stroke. He looked at her then, really looked at her, seeing the raw, naked intensity in her gaze. The skepticism didn't vanish, but it shifted into something closer to curiosity. He nodded once and shifted the dough toward her side of the table. 3 layers, then, he said quietly. But the middle one decides everything. If you mess up the center, the whole structure collapses. It's a metaphor for the bakery, really. They worked the first layer together. His guidance came through small, corrective adjustments to the rolling pin, his hand hovering near hers. Too much pressure here, he murmured, his voice a low vibration that she felt in her own chest. You're fighting the dough. You have to lead it, not force it. Nabila tried to follow, but her mind was racing. Her transcription filled the notebook margins with quick, exact lines, yet she kept glancing at the way his wrist turned. The dough took on even thickness under their combined rhythm. No one spoke for several minutes. The only sounds, the soft rasp of flour shifting and the faint creak of the table legs. The warmth from the ovens pressed against her back, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of vulnerability, as if by sharing this space and this recipe, she was exposing the wound of her grandmother's absence. Nabila tasted a small piece of the partial batter. The sweetness spread across her tongue, followed by the sharp lift of cardamom, its warmth blooming slow at the back of her throat. For a moment the taste triggered a visceral reaction, a flash of a memory that wasn't hers, a scent of a kitchen she had never visited, a feeling of safety she had never known. It was a key turning in a lock. If the tradition of this cake held the secret to the East Grove, then the flavor was the evidence of a cultural footprint that no municipal map could erase. Bahram's shoulder rolls slowed as he watched her. He set the pin aside and wiped his hands on a towel, his gaze tracking the way she stepped back from the table. She moved toward the door with the recipe page and the hidden note tucked deep inside her notebook, her heart still hammering. The threshold felt wider than it had on the way in, the light from the street cutting a sharp line across the floorboards. A sharp, commanding voice carried from the street, slicing through the warmth of the bakery. Jovan Petrov spoke to a man in a suit about permit talk starting early, his words clipped and declarative. The zoning is clear, Jovan's voice rang out, cold and devoid of sentiment. The grove is an eyesore, and the bakery is a liability. We start the clearing process the moment the hearing concludes. I don't care about the heritage of the place. I care about the square footage. Bahram's hands stilled on the towel, his knuckles whitening until they were the color of the flour on his skin. He didn't move, but his entire frame seemed to rigidify, a sudden, brittle tension taking hold of him. Nabila remained in the doorway, the recipe now fully out of sight, the scent of sugar still clinging to her sleeves. The voice outside continued, each syllable tightening the air like a noose. The recipe was no longer a puzzle or a bridge to a lost relative. It was a weapon, and the clock had just started ticking. Chapter 2. Bahram wiped his hands on the towel, flour clinging in pale streaks across his knuckles, and looked up to find Nabila already back at the table. She was watching the dough with a clinical intensity, her gaze fixed on the shape it had taken under his palms. The cardamom scent rose thicker now, cutting through the sugar that still clung to her sleeves, while the faint creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath her steps lingered in the quiet kitchen air. Sunlight slanted through the high window, catching motes of flour that drifted like unsettled dust. Bahram felt the weight of her attention, not as a student, but as an auditor. Equal hands only, he said, the words carrying a faint Persian lift at the end. It was less a welcome and more a boundary. He shrugged one shoulder without breaking the rhythm of his cleaning, his fingers flexing against the fabric in a deliberate motion. Nabila had opened her mouth to ask about the recipe's origin, about the aunt who had penned those cryptic notes in the library archives, yet the deflection landed cleanly. She caught the faint tightening at the corner of his mouth, a half smile that never reached his eyes. I'm not here to be a spectator, Bahram, Nabila replied. Her voice was cool, but her fingers were trembling slightly as she reached for the measuring spoons. As she began to spoon the cardamom, she didn't follow his lead. She paused, glancing at the handwritten note in her apron pocket, then adjusted the amount, adding a pinch more than the recipe called for. Bahram's hand stopped midair. The recipe is a science, not a suggestion. If you alter the ratio, you ruin the structural integrity of the layer. The recipe is incomplete, she countered, her eyes meeting his. The margins mention a hidden warmth that isn't listed in the ingredients. I'm looking for the gap. If you want this to be a perfect recreation, you have to admit that the paper you're defending is missing something. Bahram's expression hardened. He didn't like the implication that his mastery, or the legacy he guarded, was flawed. Amateurs look for secrets in the margins because they cannot master the basics in the center. Follow the measurements, or you are wasting my flour. The tension between them was a physical thing, as thick as the dough on the marble. Nabila didn't flinch. She simply held the spoon poised over the bowl, the silence stretching until the door opened without ceremony. Farhan stepped inside, his face a ghostly shade of gray. The land rights filing shows a 30-day window at best. Jovan's earlier note on the permits undercuts any extension we could file. His fingers steepled at once, a habit that tightened when numbers turned against him. He didn't look at Nabila. His eyes flicked briefly to the half-rolled dough, as though measuring its progress against the ticking clock of a legal eviction. Bahram set the towel aside, the fabric landing in a soft heap. As Farhan slapped the regulatory note onto the counter, the edge catching a dusting of flour, Bahram's breath hitched. He didn't just look at the paper, he recoiled from it, his chest tightening as if the air in the room had suddenly vanished. Nabila watched the paper, her fingers tracing the apron edge. She saw the official seal of the municipal office, the same office that had been slowly strangling the village's independent shops for years. Jovan isn't just filing a standard permit, Farhan pressed on, his voice dropping. He's pushing for a blighted property designation. If he can prove the bakery isn't operating as a primary commercial entity, if the permits are lapsed or the usage is inconsistent, he can force a sale to the development group. He's not trying to buy the building, Bahram. He's trying to erase the deed. Bahram's shoulders held a fraction higher than usual, a silent calculation. He knew the deed was a mess of old family handoffs and undocumented transfers. He looked at the dough, then at the regulatory note. The bakery wasn't just a business. It was the last anchor of a heritage that Jovan Petrov wanted to pave over for a luxury resort. How much time exactly? Bahram asked. His tone clipped, though his voice sounded strained, as if he were speaking through a closed throat. 30 days until the hearing, Farhan replied, his knuckles whitening. Unless we can produce a historical claim or a registered cultural easement that supersedes the current zoning. But we have nothing. No one kept the records. Nabila's hand tightened on the recipe card in her pocket. She remembered the strange clue she had spotted in the library, the mention of a foundation stone and a sweet proof. She looked at Bahram, seeing the desperation he was trying to mask with professional arrogance. The recipe, Nabila whispered, more to herself than to them. It's not just a cake. My aunt didn't keep it in a cookbook. She kept it in the archives under property and land. Why would a dessert be filed with the land deeds? Bahram turned to her, his skepticism momentarily replaced by a sharp, piercing curiosity. What are you talking about? The notes in the margins, she said, pulling the yellowed card out. There are coordinates here, Bahram. Not for ingredients, but for a location. I thought it was a family joke, but if Jovan is moving this fast, maybe this recipe is the only map we have to the original deed. Bahram looked at the paper, then back at Nabila. The professional friction was still there, but it had shifted. They were no longer two strangers arguing over flour, but two people clinging to the same life raft. If you're wrong, Bahram said, his voice low and raw, you've spent your afternoon chasing a ghost. If you're right, we have to figure out how to bake this thing perfectly. Because if this is a cultural claim, the cake itself is the evidence. It has to be the exact version that existed when the land was first granted. They returned to the dough, but the atmosphere had shifted from a lesson to a mission. Bahram guided the rolling pin, and Nabila matched the pressure, their movements synchronized by a sudden, desperate necessity. The rolling motion created a soft, rhythmic thump against the wooden board, blending with the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant street noise. When they each tasted the finished edge, the shared smile was gone, replaced by a grim mutual understanding. Jovan's move leaves us exposed to the faster track, Bahram said after Farhan had receded down the lane. He reached for the ledger drawer beneath the counter, his movements jerky. As he pulled it open, a small stack of overdue notices slid out, fluttering onto the flour-dusted floor. Nabila looked down and saw the red ink of final warnings, debts that far exceeded the bakery's monthly revenue. Bahram froze, his hand hovering over the drawer. He didn't try to hide them. The mask of the stoic master had cracked, leaving him looking fragile in the harsh afternoon light. He'd been fighting a losing battle long before Jovan arrived. Nabila offered a memory, her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. My aunt kept a jar of the same spice on the highest shelf. She never measured it aloud, only by the sound it made when poured. She told me that some things are only preserved when they are shared. Bahram's hands paused. He thought of his own family's quiet distributions, papers signed under names that never matched the voices that spoke them. He looked at Nabila, really looked at her, and saw the resolve in her eyes. They settled the split for the middle layer without further words. Outside the front window, a single sheet of paper pressed flat against the glass, its printed header visible. The signature line bore the alias Bahram used for the heritage grants, a desperate attempt to hide the bakery's vulnerability. Nabila saw it, but she did not mention it. Bahram moved the bowl aside and wiped the counter in one long, precise stroke. "The second layer waits for the same hands," he said. The Persian phrasing was still there, but the tone had changed. It was no longer a warning to stay in her place. It was an invitation to fight. She met his eyes for the space of a breath, the unspoken question settling between them like the flower dust that refused to clear. Beyond the glass, the notice trembled once more in a rising breeze, a herald of the storm coming for them both. Chapter 3. Winta leaned on her walking stick beside the tasting table, the wood worn smooth from years of village kitchens. The late afternoon light slanted through the half-open shutters, catching on the fine layer of flour that had settled across the scarred oak surface. She shifted her weight slightly, the stick's tip pressing into the floorboards with a soft, deliberate sound. "Tell me what the first bite brings up," she said, her voice carrying that familiar melodic rise that waited for an answer without hurry, the kind of tone that had coaxed secrets from reluctant apprentices for decades. Nabila set the spoon down, her throat tightening. The cardamom lingered on her tongue, sharp and pine-rich, followed by the dense sweetness of date sugar that clung to the roof of her mouth. She didn't just taste the spices, she felt a sudden, violent surge of vertigo, as if the floor had tilted. The flavor was a key turning in a lock she had spent 15 years trying to keep closed. She rolled the flavors over once more, her breathing becoming shallow. Cardamom sits forward first, then the sweetness from the date sugar settles behind it. The texture stays soft, but not heavy. Her words were clipped, delivered with a clinical precision that acted as a shield. She gripped the spoon's handle until her knuckles turned white, fighting the instinctive urge to recoil from the memory the taste had unearthed. Bahram stood a step back, his hands still dusted from the counter. He watched the way her shoulders had locked, the sudden rigidity of her spine. He had spent the morning mocking her reliance on the handwritten notes, calling her approach textbook and soulless, but seeing her now, he realized the precision wasn't about perfection. It was about control. She wasn't just following a recipe, she was holding onto a lifeline to keep from drowning. The kitchen's warmth pressed against him, the faint crackle of the oven cooling behind them mixing with the low hum of the village outside. He noticed the way Nabila's gaze flicked toward the window, her pupils dilated, her chest heaving in a rhythm that suggested panic rather than satisfaction. Winta nodded once, her eyes narrowing. She didn't miss the tremor in Nabila's hand. "That matches what the page promised. Now tell me where the taste took you when you were small. And don't give me a chemistry report, Nabila. Give me the truth." The question hung in the air, a gentle prod that felt, to Nabila, like a surgical incision. Nabila's fingers found the apron edge near her waist and traced the seam twice, the rough cotton catching against her skin. A sudden, hot pressure built behind her eyes. "My aunt kept a similar spice tin on the shelf above the stove," she whispered, the words scraping against her throat. She never measured out loud, she just knew. The sentence broke, the last word barely audible. She felt a cold sweat break across her neck. The memory wasn't a warm embrace. It was the smell of rain on a windowsill, and the sound of a door slamming shut for the last time. "Your aunt," Winta repeated, her voice dropping an octave, losing its melodic quality. "The one who lived in the valley cottage before the first seizure." Nabila froze. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out by the mention of the word seizure-ek. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She looked at Winta and saw not just a mentor but a witness to a crime. "That recipe isn't just a collection of ingredients, Nabila," Winta continued, her grip tightening on the walking stick until the wood groaned. "It belonged to a woman who believed the land was a trust, not a commodity. Your aunt didn't just lose her home to a bank, she was stripped of it by a legal maneuver that would make a thief blush. She lost her garden, her peace, and eventually her mind to the same kind of developments that is currently knocking on Bahram's door. She wrote those notes, not for a cook, but as a map of what was stolen. The spices, the proportions, they are the only things the lawyers couldn't put a lien on." The vanilla that clung to the mixing bowl lifted again as Bahram shifted the lid aside, its sweetness cutting through the cardamom's bite. Nabila felt a visceral chill run down her spine, a physical reaction that made her shiver despite the heat of the ovens. The recipe wasn't a hobby, it was a ghost. The mysterious marginalia she had found in the library, the cryptic references to boundaries, soil acidity, and the root of the matter, suddenly shifted from culinary curiosity to a desperate, coded plea for justice. Bahram reached for the cloth that hung by the sink, the fabric cool against his palm. He didn't wipe the counter, he gripped the cloth tight, his jaw set. "You're saying the cake is a record?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. The professional fiction that had defined his interactions with Nabila, the clash between his intuition and her precision, vanished instantly. It was replaced by a sharp, jagged alignment of purpose. He looked at Nabila, no longer seeing an amateur librarian, but a survivor of the same war he was currently fighting. If this recipe is linked to the Old Valley claims, then the people trying to evict us aren't just looking for real estate. They're trying to erase the evidence of who actually owns the soil. They aren't just buying land, they're scrubbing a crime scene. Winta's smile was a grim, hard thing. The lines around her eyes deepened as she waited, her stick tapping once against the table leg, in a rhythm that suggested a patience worn thin by decades of loss. Nabila's voice was a ghost of itself. The tin had a dent on the side from when it fell once. She stopped, her breath catching in a sob she refused to let escape. She realized that by recreating this flavor, she had accidentally summoned a history that had been violently suppressed. The dent in the tin was a memory, but the loss of the house was an open wound, and the taste of the cake had just ripped the stitches out. The half-finished layer sat on the plate between them, steam thinning into the air. Bahram wiped a streak of flour from the wood and set the cloth down with a heavy thud. The silence stretching between them was no longer empty. It was thick with the weight of a shared enemy. Nabila's chest tightened, her lungs burning. The bridge of trust was no longer being built with shy glances. It was being forged in the fire of a common threat. Nabila stepped away from the table edge, the floorboards cool beneath her feet. She looked at the cooling dish and then at the handwritten page. The recipe was no longer a puzzle to be solved for the sake of a perfect crumb. It was a weapon. If the proportions and the notes in the margins could be decoded, they might find a legal loophole, a forgotten deed, or a boundary line that could halt the bulldozers. Bahram gathered the unused cardamom pods and folded them into a small paper packet, the pods rustling softly. His movements were faster now, driven by a new, urgent energy. He looked at Nabila, his gaze steady and fierce. "We can't just bake this. We have to decode it. Every ingredient, every note, we treat it like a legal document. If your aunt left a map in the cardamom, we're going to find where it leads." Winta straightened her back and looked toward the door where the light had shifted, shadows lengthening across the threshold like encroaching fingers. "Jovan will be here in the morning to discuss the front permits," she warned, her voice flat and hard. "He doesn't want a bakery here, and he certainly doesn't want the memory of the Valley Cottage returning to haunt him. He thinks the past is buried." She looked at Nabila, her eyes piercing. "Show him that some things, once baked into the soul of a place, can never be scrubbed away." The unvoiced pressure of the village's survival hung there, pressing the kitchen's warmth into something thinner, more urgent, and infinitely more dangerous. Chapter 4. Bahram pulled the ledger drawer open beneath the counter while Nabila measured the next scoop of sugar into the bowl. The metal runners grated harshly against wood worn smooth by years of hands, a jagged sound that sliced through the warmth of the kitchen. Nabila's wrist hitched, the spoon trembling slightly over the scale. She kept her eyes on the white granules, but the sudden, violent noise of the drawer felt like a breach of the fragile peace they had established. "The cardamom pods from last night stayed in the packet," he said. His voice was low, but there was a tension in it, a tightness that hadn't been there during the first bake. He didn't look at her. His flour-dusted fingers brushed the edge of a thick leather-bound book before they stilled on a page. "My mother kept one just like this when we first came here. She recorded every cent, every kilo of flour, every broken jar. She wrote in a hand that never shook, even when she couldn't afford the heat for the winter." Nabila set the spoon down with a sharp clink. The sugar settled into a neat cone, but her chest felt suddenly constricted, as if the air in the room had grown too thick to breathe. She had expected the stoic baker to be a wall of silence. To hear him speak of his mother's desperation felt like being handed a piece of raw nerve. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the way his knuckles were white where he gripped the ledger. He wasn't just reminiscing, he was bracing himself. Bahram turned a page, then stopped. His thumb pressed into the yellowed paper with such force that the page buckled. That's impossible, he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. Nabila stepped closer, the scent of vanilla and yeast clinging to her apron, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. What is it? The property tax records, Bahram said, his brow furrowing into a deep, jagged line. He pointed to a series of entries from a decade ago. The ink was fading, but the numbers were stark, repetitive, and bleeding into the margins. Look here, a recurring payment was made to a holding company, the Heritage Trust. But there is no corresponding lease agreement, no deed. My mother spent 15 years paying into a fund that doesn't officially exist. Nabila felt a cold prickle of intuition slide down her spine. She thought of the recipe in the library, the handwritten notes, the desperate precision of the cardamom measurements. It hadn't been a hobby for the woman who wrote it. It had been a map. Could it be a land trust? A secret agreement to keep the bakery out of the hands of the council? Bahram didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on the ledger, his expression hardening into something brittle. If the trust wasn't properly registered, the land doesn't belong to the bakery. It reverts to the municipal council, or to whoever bought the council's outstanding debt. A thin envelope slid under the front door. The sound of paper against tile was a sharp, sudden hiss. It came to rest near the threshold, the corner catching on a loose nail. Bahram didn't move. He didn't even blink. He simply stared at the ledger, his jaw locking so tightly that a muscle jumped in his cheek. Nabila felt a wave of vertigo. The silence between them was no longer cozy. It was a vacuum. She crossed the room, her footsteps sounding unnervingly loud. She picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive, and felt cold against her fingertips. She tore it open, her breath hitching in her throat. As she read the typed lines, the words seemed to vibrate on the page. "This is a demolition notice," Nabila whispered, her voice cracking. "For the rear wall. They're citing the permit violation Farhan mentioned. It says the structure is unstable and an eyesore to the planned revitalization of the waterfront." Revitalization, Bahram spat, the word sounding like a curse. He finally looked at her, and the raw frustration in his eyes made her recoil. Jovan's favorite word for a luxury hotel. He's not just cleaning up the street, he's clearing the board. "Bahram, look at the date," Nabila said, her voice rising, the panic finally breaking through. "The demolition is set for the end of the month. That's 3 weeks. We don't have time to fight this in court." Bahram's hand slammed down on the ledger, a cloud of flour erupting from the pages like a miniature explosion. He didn't shout, but the violence of the gesture made Nabila jump back. "He knows," Bahram hissed. "Jovan knows about the trust discrepancy. He's not waiting for a legal eviction, he's trying to physically erase the building before we can find the paperwork that proves we own the ground." Nabila stared at the notice, then at the man standing amidst the flour and the scent of cardamom. The stakes had shifted violently. The recipe was no longer a tribute to a lost relative or a culinary puzzle. It was a piece of evidence. If the woman who wrote that recipe had been part of the Heritage Trust, the book was the only thing standing between Bahram and total ruin. "We have to find out who the trust belonged to," Nabila said, her voice trembling but firm. "If the recipe is linked to the trust, then the cake is the only way to draw out the people who remember." Bahram looked at her, his eyes searching hers with a mixture of skepticism and desperation. For a moment, the professional friction, the clash between her clinical precision and his intuition, vanished, replaced by a shared, visceral fear. "You think a cake can stop a bulldozer?" he asked, though the bite was gone from his tone. "I think this village remembers things that aren't written in ledgers," she replied. They returned to the dough, but the rhythm was gone. They worked in a heavy, suffocating silence. Nabila measured the butter, her hand shaking so badly she nearly spilled the gold block onto the counter. Bahram folded the dough with aggressive, jerky motions, as if he were trying to knead the frustration out of the flour. The butter softened under their palms, but the sweetness of the scent now felt cloying, masking the metallic tang of anxiety that filled the room. "The ratio needs another pinch of salt to cut the sweetness," Nabila said, her voice small. She was trying to anchor herself to the process, to the only thing she could control. Bahram didn't respond. He just kept folding, his shoulders hunched, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. He was a man watching his ancestral home slip through his fingers, and the vulnerability of it made Nabila want to reach out and touch his arm. But she feared he might shatter if she did. When the layer finally came from the oven, the edges were a perfect golden brown, but neither of them smiled. Bahram tasted a fragment, his eyes closing for a second. He passed the plate to Nabila. The flavor was an explosion of warmth and citrus, a taste of home and heritage, but it tasted like ash in the face of the demolition notice. Nabila lingered after the plate was set aside. She moved to the window and peered through the blinds. Outside, Jovan Petrov was walking past. He didn't stop, but he slowed his pace, his silhouette sharp and predatory against the morning light. He didn't look at the bakery, but he tilted his head slightly, as if he could smell the cardamom and the fear wafting through the vents. Bahram closed the ledger with a definitive thud and slid it back into the drawer. The metal runners grated again, a sound of finality. He looked at Nabila, and for the first time the stoicism was gone. He looked exhausted. "If we fail," he whispered, "there won't be anything left to save." Nabila looked at the flour on her hands, the same flour that coated Bahram's knuckles. They weren't just baking a cake anymore. They were fighting a war with the only weapons they had: sugar, spice, and a fading memory. Chapter 5. Nabila Voss tipped the cardamom-scented oil into the bowl. At the precise moment, the ocean breeze swept through the bakery window, carrying a sharp metallic bite of salt that made the batter's surface ripple. The air inside thickened, the warmth of the ovens colliding with the brine to create a heavy, humid atmosphere that clung to the skin. Bahram Sultani stood at the opposite counter, his flour-dusted hands gripping a rolling pin with a tension that turned his knuckles white. He wasn't just watching her, he was scrutinizing her, his gaze a physical weight that tracked every micro-movement of her wrist. The third step of the recipe demanded a precarious emulsion, a delicate balance of fat and fragrance. Nabila measured the liquid in increments, her movements clinical and rigid. Each drop landed with a soft plink, a sound that felt like a countdown in the oppressive silence of the kitchen. "You're treating it like a chemistry experiment," Bahram said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Baking isn't about precision alone, Nabila. It's about feeling the resistance of the batter. If you only follow the ink, you're missing the soul of the dish." Nabila's hand faltered, a single drop of oil splashing outside the bowl. She didn't look up, but her throat tightened, a sudden sharp constriction that made it hard to swallow. "The ink is all I have left," she replied, her voice strained. "My parents sailed these waters every summer until the day they didn't. This recipe is the only thing that survived the wreckage of that family. I can't afford to feel my way into a mistake." The admission didn't float away, it landed between them like a stone. Nabila felt a sudden visceral surge of exposure, as if she had stripped bare in the middle of the flour-dusted room. She waited for the clinical distance to return, or worse, for Bahram to offer a platitude. Instead, she heard the heavy thud of his boots as he stepped closer. Bahram stopped just short of her space, the scent of yeast and cedar surrounding him. "Loss doesn't make a recipe a map," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the edge. "It makes it a ghost. If you try to recreate a ghost exactly, you'll only find a void. You have to bring it into the present." Nabila finally looked at him. His eyes weren't mocking, they were haunted by a mirrored kind of desperation. For a moment, the friction between his intuition and her precision vanished, replaced by a raw, humming vulnerability. The air between them felt charged, a static electricity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. Winta Kebede leaned on her walking stick near the doorway, her voice a dry rasp that broke the spell. "The ghost is hungry, child, and it won't be satisfied by a textbook." The older woman's gaze was piercing, seeing through Nabila's composure to the trembling in her fingers. "Your aunt didn't write those notes for a student, she wrote them for a survivor." As Nabila reached for the final fold of the batter, she paused. She looked down at the handwritten page, then back at the bowl. The emulsion was beginning to shudder. The recipe called for a silver salt bloom, a term that defied every culinary manual Nabila had ever memorized. It wasn't a measurement, it was a state of matter, a crystalline texture that the current mixture lacked. Suddenly, the batter broke. The oil beaded away from the flour in greasy yellow spheres, the emulsion collapsing in a heartbeat. Nabila froze, her breath hitching in her chest. The failure felt like a physical blow, a sudden drop in pressure that left her lightheaded. A sharp, acidic tang rose from the ruined batch, smelling of wasted effort and old grief. Bahram didn't laugh. He didn't even offer a critique. He simply looked at the bowl, and Nabila saw his jaw set in a hard line. "The sea has its own schedule," he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual stoicism. He looked at her, and for the first time the mask of the stoic baker cracked. "We don't have time for a second failure. Petrov isn't just waiting for a date on a calendar, he's hunting for a weakness." Farhan Malik stepped forward, the permit notice in his hand trembling slightly. "The municipal board has moved the accelerated date," he announced, his voice clipping the air. 2 days earlier. If we don't produce a viable product for the hearing, the eviction is automatic. There is no further appeal. The news hit Nabila like a wave of ice water. The pressure settled across her chest, a crushing weight that made her lungs feel too small for the room. "It's not the technique," she whispered, staring at the separated oil. "It's the bloom. I don't know what the silver salt bloom is, and without it, the layers won't hold. The cake will collapse." Winta's expression shifted, a shadow of ancient, protective grief crossing her face. "The bloom isn't something you buy in a store, Nabila. It's a harvest. It only forms on the salt crust of the northern tide pools during the equinox, and only if the minerals are gathered by someone who knows how to ask the earth for them." Bahram scoffed, though it sounded more like a defense mechanism than genuine skepticism. "You're talking about folklore, Winta. We are fighting a legal eviction with a cake. We can't rely on tide pool mysticism while the bulldozers are idling at the curb." "It is not mysticism, it is the signature of this land," Winta countered, her voice snapping like a whip. "The recipe was written by a woman who knew the bones of this coast. If you want this cake to be evidence, to prove that this bakery is a cultural landmark and not just a plot of real estate, you cannot substitute the bloom with table salt. The judges will taste the absence of the land. They will know it's a fake." Nabila felt a sudden, instinctive urge to recoil, to retreat into the safety of the library stacks where things were categorized and predictable. She took a step back, her heel catching on a floorboard, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. The fear of failure was no longer a quiet hum. It was a roar. Before she could retreat further, Bahram's hand shot out. He didn't grab her, but his palm hovered an inch from her sleeve, a warm, steady presence that acted as a barrier against her flight. The heat radiating from his skin grounded her, forcing her to stop. She looked up into his eyes and saw a fierce, desperate resolve. He wasn't just fighting for a building, he was fighting for the only thing he had left to call his own. "Who knows how to gather it?" Nabila asked, her voice shaking but audible. "Elias Thorne," Winta replied. "But he hasn't spoken to a soul from this village in 10 years. He lives in the marshes, and he has every reason to hate the people who stood by while the land was sold piece by piece to men like Petrov." The stakes had shifted violently. This was no longer a culinary quest for closure. It was a desperate gamble for survival. If they couldn't secure the bloom, the cake would be a lie, and the bakery would be a memory. They began the cleanup in a heavy electric silence. Every clink of a spoon against a bowl felt like a gavel striking. Nabila felt a strange magnetic tension humming between her and Bahram. The professional friction had evolved into something more volatile, a shared desperation that bound them together in the wreckage of the ruined batter. "I'll go with her," Bahram said suddenly. His voice was low, almost a growl. "If Thorne is as stubborn as Winta says, he won't listen to a stranger. He needs to see that the bakery is still fighting. He needs to see that someone is actually willing to get their hands dirty for this place." Nabila looked at him, surprised by the sudden alignment. The distance between them had vanished, replaced by the rhythm of a shared mission. She felt a sudden sharp spark of something that wasn't fear, a flicker of defiance. "The balance feels right in theory," she said, her voice gaining strength as she looked at the ruined bowl. "But we need that salt. We need the anchor." Bahram nodded, a subtle, sharp movement. "The cardamom is the heart, but the bloom is the bone." He wiped his hands on a cloth, the motion deliberate and slow. For a fleeting second his gaze lingered on her lips, a moment of unspoken intensity that made Nabila's heart hammer against her ribs, before he turned away to calibrate the oven. They slid a smaller test tray into the heat, the quiet broken only by Winta's patient breathing and the rhythmic creak of her walking stick. When the test slice emerged, it was technically perfect, but as Nabila tasted it, she felt a hollow void. It was a ghost of a cake, pretty, scented, but lacking the visceral grounding depth of the land. It tasted of absence. Outside the window, the low, predatory rumble of an engine vibrated through the glass. Javon Petrov's black sedan idled at the curb, a shark circling a wounded reef. He didn't enter, he simply sat there, reviewing a fresh stack of documents on the passenger seat. The papers bore new red seals and shifted dates, moving the regulatory ground beneath them once more. He wasn't waiting for a deadline, he was waiting for the moment they finally broke. Chapter 6. The fourth layer cooled on the marble counter when the first villagers pushed through the bakery door. Steam rose in thin curls from the cardamom-dusted slices, carrying the faint bite of citrus zest that had been folded into the batter hours earlier. The air hung thick with the scent of toasted nuts and warm sugar, but beneath the sweetness lay a tension that felt almost tactile, like a wire stretched too tight. Nabila set the plate at the center of the communal table, her fingers lingering on the rim. She wasn't just serving a cake, she was presenting a gamble. If the flavors didn't trigger the specific, ancestral memory they were hunting for, they had no leverage against the developers. Bahram adjusted the cloth beneath the plate, his shoulder rolling in a slow, deliberate motion. Flour dusted the dark hairs of his forearm, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the arriving faces. He wasn't looking for approval, he was looking for a spark. He knew as well as Nabila did that the recipe was a fragmented map, and this tasting was the only way to verify if they were heading in the right direction. "Taste it while it's still warm," he said, his voice low, the Persian turn at the end of the sentence softening the invitation. "The C-note holds better that way," Mrs. Boyce. Harrow from the post office leaned in first, breaking off a corner with careful thumb and forefinger. She chewed slowly, her eyes narrowing against the late light slanting through the front window. For a moment she went perfectly still. Her breathing hitched, a sudden sharp intake of air that seemed to freeze her lungs. Then her jaw worked as though she were chewing through a wall of time. "My grandmother," she whispered, her voice cracking, a raw sound that vibrated in the quiet room. "She made this for the solstice feast. But she always said the secret was in the salt, not table salt, but the brine from the old tide pools." The room shifted. It wasn't just a compliment, it was a clue. The group leaned closer, the air suddenly electric. A second villager, the retired fisherman Elias, nodded without speaking. He took his share, the metal of his spoon ringing faintly against the ceramic. As the flavor settled, his shoulders eased, but his gaze immediately flicked toward the closed folder that had arrived with Farhan. Farhan Malik entered last, the folder tucked under one arm like a weapon. The door swung shut behind him with a soft click that silenced the room. He cleared his throat, the sound dry and clinical. "The revised proposal arrived this morning. Jovan's team has accelerated the timeline. The demolition permits for the North Quadrant, including the library annex, are being fast-tracked." Bahram's hands paused above the counter. Nabila felt a sudden, cold hollow open in her stomach, a physical drop that left her lightheaded. The library annex was where the original recipe had been found. If it went, any other clues hidden in the archives would be pulverized into rubble. Inside her chest, the question tightened, how long before the ledger's false name met these same eyes? She wondered if Farhan already suspected the illegality of Bahram's current tenure, or if Jovan was using the permits to smoke them out. "Accelerated how?" Bahram asked. The question landed without accusation, yet the room quieted. His fingers flexed against the counter edge, a small motion he covered by reaching for a cloth, though his knuckles were white. Farhan set the folder down but did not open it. "Jovan is offering a heritage compromise. They'll keep the bakery footprint intact, but only if the heritage designation is dropped. In exchange, the village gets a shared community kitchen in the new luxury development." He paused, his voice lengthening as though trying to salve a lie to himself. "My grandmother lost her stall the same way. I told them this version at least leaves something standing." "It leaves a shell," Elias spat, his voice suddenly rough. He pointed a trembling finger at the slice of cake. "This taste, it isn't just a dessert. It's the taste of the old commons. The land that was stolen from the families during the 1920s land grab." The admission hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Nabila felt the small recognition pass through the group like a current. The cake had acted as a key, unlocking a collective grief that had been suppressed for generations. The scent of cardamom and citrus was no longer just a culinary success. It was a visceral reminder of what had been lost and what was currently being threatened. She spoke before the silence could turn into despair, her voice shaking slightly before she steadied it. "The recipe I found, it had notes in the margins. Not just about ingredients, but about boundaries. It mentioned the salt line of the original village charter." Bahram's gaze flicked toward her, holding for a beat longer than necessary. He knew the legal implications. If the recipe was linked to the original charter, it wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a deed. It was the only thing that could legally halt Jovan's bulldozers. Bahram's dry humor surfaced, though it was edged with steel. "So, Jovan wants us to trade our history for a shiny new kitchen and a resort we can't afford to visit." How generous. He looked at the villagers, his voice gaining strength. "He thinks we've forgotten who we are because we've been quiet. He thinks this bakery is just a shop." The group laughed, a short, sharp sound of defiance. Fairhand's fingers steepled, then dropped, revealing the tension he had tried to mask. He looked at the cake, then at the determined faces around him. The Heritage Compromise was suddenly looking like a poor investment. A young mother near the back added her own story about the annual herring bake, her voice gaining strength as others murmured agreement. The unity felt less like dough and more like concrete, setting quickly. Midway through the second round of slices, Nabila stepped back. A wave of nausea rolled through her, the sudden crushing weight of the secret she shared with Bahram. If the alias in the ledger surfaced, would this newfound solidarity vanish? Would they see her and Bahram as saviors or as frauds? She pressed the fear down, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and reached for the cardamom jar, its glass cool against her palm. She passed it to Bahram. Their hands met on the lid, the contact brief and steady. He accepted it, his movements slower, more grounded, though she could see the slight tremor in his wrist. The villagers continued passing the plate, their voices overlapping in a low hum of strategic planning. They weren't just reminiscing anymore, they were organizing. Jovan's already drafting the press release, Barhan said, though his tone had shifted from messenger to confidant. He'll frame it as progress that respects the past. He's going to announce the compromise at the town hall on Friday. Then we have until Friday to prove the land isn't his to develop, Bahram replied. He weighed the jar once before setting it beside the remaining slices. Progress usually costs more than the headline admits. This time, he's paying the price. The fourth layer disappeared slice by slice, consumed not as a treat, but as a sacrament of resistance. Nabila stayed near the window, watching the light change on the water. The conversation around her had shifted from the taste of the cake to the location of the old charter. No one mentioned the permits again, because they were no longer afraid of them. Fairham gathered the folder but left it closed, his glance lingering on the documents with a new sense of doubt. The question of what the next layer would cost remained, but for the first time, Nabila felt they had something worth fighting for. Chapter 7. Nabila pushed open the gate to Winta Kebede's cottage and stopped dead. Tacked to the doorframe was a red notice, its edges curling in the salt air, the official stamp of the Municipal Development Board screaming in vivid, wet ink. She didn't just read the words, she felt them like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Notice of immediate inspection and conditional caesarestia. The document didn't merely list the property for review, it declared the land unproductive and slated for the first phase of the coastal resort project. Nabila's vision blurred. She looked at the small tin of cardamom in her hands, the metal suddenly freezing, and felt a violent tightening in her throat that made it impossible to swallow. This cottage wasn't just a house, it was the only place in this village that felt like a sanctuary, the only place where the ghosts of her own lost family seemed to whisper in the steam of a tea kettle. To see it marked for erasure felt like a second bereavement. She didn't stand there in passive shock. Nabila stepped forward, her boots scraping harshly against the uneven pathstones, and ripped the notice from the wood. She crumpled the paper in her fist, the official seal folding under her grip, her chest heaving. Winta stood in the open doorway, her walking stick planted firm against the threshold. She didn't look surprised, but her jaw was set in a hard, jagged line, her knuckles white where they gripped the wood of her cane. "The lights are on for those who need them," she said. Her voice usually carried a steady, maternal cadence, but now it had a sharp, metallic edge. The sound of a woman who had already decided how she would fight. Behind her, a pot simmered on the stove, releasing the scent of warm milk and crushed seeds, a domestic peace that felt fragile and fraudulent against the threat outside. Nabila crossed the threshold, the floorboards creaking under her weight, and thrust the crumpled paper toward the older woman. "Winta, this is insane. It says they can take the house by morning. We have to call the council. We have to." "The council is in Petrov's pocket, Nabila," Winta interrupted, her eyes locking onto Nabila's with a sudden, piercing intensity. "Jovan Petrov doesn't want the land for the view. He wants the deed. He believes the original land grants, the ones that protect this entire strip of coast from development, are buried in the memories of the old, or perhaps in the things we've forgotten how to read." She stepped aside, her gesture not an invitation, but a command. "Which is why we must finish the cake. Not for the taste, Nabila, for the proof." Villagers began to file in one by one. There was no greeting, no polite chatter. Their movements were heavy, their faces etched with a grim collective desperation. This was no longer a casual gathering, it was a war council disguised as a kitchen. An older man brought a bundle of fresh thyme tied with string, laying it on the counter with fingers that trembled so violently he nearly dropped it. A woman followed, setting down a jar of honey. The glass caught the overhead light, casting golden, blood-like reflections across the worn tabletop. The air was thick, electric, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Nabila placed her cardamom tin beside the offerings, her heart hammering against her ribs, the room vibrating with a shared, suffocating anxiety. Bahram Sultani arrived last. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't even look at Nabila at first. He walked straight to the counter and set down a tray of dough portions with a metallic clang that echoed like a gunshot, making several people jump. "The fifth layer needs steady hands tonight," he said, his voice low and urgent, vibrating with a suppressed rage. He didn't look at the cake, he looked at Winta with a fierce, protective desperation. Then he leaned in closer to Nabila, his shoulder brushing hers, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that sent a shiver of alarm down her spine. I checked the ledger again. The bakery's title is linked to this cottage through a shared easement. If Winta loses her home, the resort has a legal bridge to walk right into my kitchen. If this house falls, the bakery is next. The revelation hit Nabila like a physical weight. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't just about Winta's memories, but about Bahram's entire life's work. They began the work, but the atmosphere had shifted from cozy to combustible. Nabila measured the spice into the warm milk while Bahram folded in the next portion of dough, their elbows colliding in the narrow space. Every touch felt like a jolt of electricity, a friction born of shared terror. As Nabila stirred, her mind raced back to the recipe page in the library, the strange, coded marginalia she had dismissed as doodles. She looked at the proportions again in her mind. The recipe wasn't just a culinary guide, it was a cipher. The specific ratios of cardamom to flour, the precise temperature of the milk. It mirrored the old surveying markers of the village. It was a map of heritage hidden in plain sight. Winta rested her hands on her stick, her voice cutting through the steam like a blade. The recipe you were following belonged to the woman who founded this collective. She didn't write it for the hunger of the belly, but for the hunger of the heart. She hid the truth of this land in the proportions of the ingredients, because a deed can be burned, a ledger can be forged, but a tradition is carried in the blood. If we can recreate it perfectly, we prove the continuity of the claim. A young father, his voice cracking with raw emotion, described how Winta had once loaned him her last jar of preserved lemons when his own supply ran low during the Great Frost. "That jar kept the fish on the table for 3 nights," he said, his eyes glistening. "If they take this house, they take the only place in this village where you don't have to prove your worth to be fed." Others joined in, their voices rising, transforming the kitchen into a sanctuary of shared defiance. Nabila listened, her own hands shaking as she held the spoon, and felt the isolation she had carried since arriving in the village dissolve into something harder, something stronger. She passed the bowl to Bahram, their fingers brushed on the rim, and this time Bahram didn't pull away. He gripped her hand for a second, a hard, grounding squeeze. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a pact of survival. Farhan Malik stepped in from the side door, his clipboard tucked under his arm, his expression grim. "The inspection notice came at dusk," he said, his clipped sentences sounding like a countdown. "Javan's team isn't just reviewing the property. They filed a motion to vacate based on a lack of historical significance. They are trying to erase the cottage's identity to make the seizure easier." He placed a folded map on the table, but he didn't open it. "He's coming tomorrow morning to survey the land. He wants us out before the sun is high." The room fell into a suffocating hush. Winta nodded once, her gaze fixed on the cake layers. "Let him come. He thinks he is fighting a house of wood and stone. He doesn't realize he is fighting a recipe that proves who we are." Nabila tasted a small spoonful of the mixture. The flavor was an explosion of warmth and memory, the cardamom balanced by the thyme, tasting of earth and endurance. She set the spoon down and looked around the table. She no longer saw a collection of eccentric villagers. She saw a community on the brink of extinction. The pledges that followed were no longer soft. The man with the thyme offered his storage shed as a staging ground for a protest. The woman with the honey promised to bring every elder in the valley to the hearing. Bahram kept the dough moving, his movements precise and aggressive, almost violent in their efficiency. "The bakery ledger is a weapon," he muttered to Nabila, his eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "If we can link the recipe's requirements to the land's original usage, we can prove the property is a cultural landmark." We don't just save the house, we stop the resort in its tracks. The final testimony came from the woman near the door, her voice a whisper of grief. Winter kept the herring bake alive when the old hall closed. If the cottage goes, the heart of the village stops beating. They portioned the finished layer into small dishes and set them to cool. Nabila remained at the counter, wiping a stray smear of dough from the edge with steady fingers, her fear having crystallized into a cold, hard resolve. Baham stood beside her, the space between them gone, their breathing synchronized in the quiet. Outside, the night air carried the sound of distant waves, sounding less like a lullaby and more like a warning. Inside, the cardamom scent lingered, binding the room in a fragrant, desperate hope. Winta placed her stick against the wall and accepted a dish from Nabila. The moment felt complete, but as Nabila looked at the red notice she had crumpled, she knew the real battle had just begun. The cake was no longer a dessert. It was Exhibit A. Chapter 8. Bahram Sultani rolled the cardamom pods between his palms, the crushed scent rising sharp and sweet in the warm air thick with yeast and wood smoke. He didn't look up as he spoke, but the usual fortress of his voice. The dry, deflective shield he used to keep the world at arm's length had cracked. It was now a low, steady drumbeat of urgency. We divide the remaining layers tonight and map every step for the hearing. No one leaves until the sequence holds. This isn't just a cake anymore. It is the only piece of evidence we have that predates the current land registry. Winta Kebede leaned on her walking stick by the door, her gaze fixed on the map spread across the flour-dusted table. Her knuckles were white, gripping the carved handle of her cane as if it were the only thing keeping her upright against the rhythmic, violent thuds echoing from outside. 2 men in Jovan Petrov's crew were hammering steel stakes into the loam beside her cottage. Each strike reverberated through the narrow lane like a slow countdown, a physical manifestation of the clock ticking toward the municipal hearing. Bahram's shoulders squared against the sound, his jaw tight, but he kept his movements precise, measuring ground spice into a shallow bowl with a hand that trembled slightly before he forced it still. Nabila Voss pushed through the bakery door with Farhan Malik at her side. She stopped short, the air in the room feeling heavy, almost combustible. Dust from Malayne clung to their shoes, and the faint metallic tang of disturbed earth drifted in behind them. Nabila felt a sudden sharp constriction in her throat. The sight of the stakes through the window wasn't just a legal dispute, it was a desecration. The crew started at dawn, Bahram continued without pause, passing a bowl to the woman from the honey stand. His fingers brushed hers briefly, a grounding touch that felt like a silent plea for stability. They claim the foundation check requires immediate access, but the paperwork lists Winta's address first. They aren't checking for cracks in the stone, they're marking the perimeter for the resort's first phase. His shoulder rolled once, a habit of tension, as he reached for the next spice jar. The motion revealed the coiled energy beneath his apron strings. The desperation of a man who had spent years hiding his heritage only to find it was the only weapon left to fight for. Farhan set his folder on the counter edge, the papers inside rustling with a clinical, cold sound. I reviewed the initial filings this morning. The permit language allows for site inspection, but the equipment they brought in is for demolition prep. Jovan is bypassing the hearing entirely by creating a safety emergencies to justify the clearing of the land. He spoke in clipped sentences that softened only when he met Winta's eyes. He didn't tell her that the legal window to stop the stakes was closing by the hour, but the way he avoided her gaze told the story. Nabila traced the recipe page with one finger, the paper's edge soft and frayed. The mysterious marginalia they had discovered, the notes linking the specific cardamom blend to the original 19th century village charter felt like a fragile lifeline. The cardamom layer cooled in shallow pans along the back shelf, its aroma filling the room, but the air grew heavier. Inside her mind, the stakes had shifted. This was no longer a culinary puzzle. It was a race to produce a physical manifestation of a historical claim. If they could prove the recipe was the living deed Winta had whispered about, the land could be reclassified as a heritage site. The penultimate steps required a precision that bordered on the ritualistic. Bahram added the next measure of thyme-infused oil, stirring in slow, hypnotic circles. This binds the heritage notes before the final bake, he explained, his voice gaining a raw, jagged edge. The specific density of this layer is what proves the origin of the ingredients that only grew on the contested plots. If the chemistry is off, the evidence is worthless. The mixture thickened, releasing a warmth that drew more villagers from the lane into the shop. They didn't come for bread, they came for a strategy. Their pledges followed quickly. One offered extra storage crates to hide the documents, his voice low and urgent. Another promised to photograph every single page of the recipe for duplicates, pulling a small camera from his pocket with shaking fingers. Bahram nodded at each, his usual guarded tone replaced by an open thread of alliance. He was no longer the solitary baker. He was the general of a kitchen. Jovan Petrov stepped inside unannounced, his forward-leaning stance filling the doorway, his expensive suit a jarring contrast to the flower-dusted sanctuary. He didn't speak at first, merely surveying the room with a look of clinical detachment. A plea from the honey-stand woman halted his advance. "My grandmother's stall stood on that same plot before the old hall closed," she said, her voice trembling yet clear. "You aren't just moving dirt, Mr. Petrov, you're erasing us." Jovan's jaw eased for a fraction of a second, his eyes shifting as if recalling a ghost of his own, but the mask slid back into place quickly. He didn't offer a reply, only a thin, predatory smile before retreating to review his notes outside. The pause that followed was a vacuum of sound. Bahram watched him go, his hands stilling mid-motion over the bowl, his chest heaving as he fought the urge to shout. Bahram wiped his hands on his apron and met the inner circle's eyes directly. "The alias I use for the heritage grants is my father's name," he admitted, the words sounding like a confession. "I tried to protect the bakery by keeping the history quiet, by pretending I was just another businessman. But that silence is what gave Jovan the opening to claim the land as vacant of cultural value. I let my fear make us vulnerable." Nabila's fingers stilled on the recipe page. The vulnerability in Bahram's voice mirrored the fragility of the paper beneath her touch. She felt a sudden, visceral pull toward him, not just affection, but a shared desperation. The bakery had become a war room, and the scent of cardamom was the scent of their resistance. As the group noted that the stakes had now extended beyond Winter's cottage to 2 neighboring homes, the atmosphere sharpened. The aroma of the cardamom layer pulled 3 more neighbors through the door, their voices adding to the planning, hands gesturing toward the map with a quiet, fierce determination. Community bonds tightened visibly around the counter, a human chain forged in the heat of the ovens. Yet the ticking clock pinned near the door pressed harder, its second hand slicing through the murmured commitments. Nabila and Bahram stepped to the side counter once the next layer settled. The cardamom scent clung to their skin like a second layer of clothing. "I fear what happens if the board rejects the evidence," Bahram admitted quietly, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, and for the first time the stoicism was gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror of loss. Nabila felt her heart hammer against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the hammers outside. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. A brief, electric contact that felt like a pact. "The village has held these recipes longer than any permit lasts," she answered, her voice a vow. "We aren't just baking a cake, Bahram, we're baking a deed. We are going to make them see us." Farhan offered a quiet nod from across the room, signaling that the legal window was now a sliver. The dish aroma continued to draw neighbors, filling the bakery with a desperate, hopeful energy. A new filing appeared on the planning board outside, Jovan's final regulatory maneuver to expedite the eviction, the crisp edges of the document fluttering in the salt breeze. Bahram returned to the group, his voice carrying the alliance openly now. The final cardamom measure waited in its tin, the room holding its collective breath. "They filed the eviction order this afternoon." Jovan's voice cut through the air from the doorway, sharp and final. "You have 48 hours to vacate." Chapter 9. Jovan Petrov did not simply stand in the bakery doorway. He occupied it, his frame blocking the afternoon light and casting a long, sharp shadow that sliced across the flour-dusted floor like a blade. The eviction notice held between his fingers was crisp, the official municipal seal catching the low light of the overhead fixture. He didn't lead with a greeting. He led with the kill. "They filed the order this afternoon," Jovan said, his voice a cold, clinical instrument that cut through the cardamom steam curling upward from the cooling racks. "The grace period is over. By the time the hearing concludes on Thursday, the demolition crews will already be on standby. This isn't a negotiation anymore, Bahram. It's a formality." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Nabila felt the air vanish from her lungs, a sudden, suffocating tightness in her throat that made it impossible to swallow. Her fingers clamped onto the edge of the marble counter, her knuckles turning a ghostly white as she gripped a stone. On the scarred wooden surface before her, the final layers of the cake waited. Mounds of spice and flour that had ceased to be a culinary experiment and had become a desperate, fragile lifeline. This wasn't just about a bakery. The recipe was the only surviving link to the ancestral land use rights of the original settlers. A specific, regional variant of the cardamom cake that required the unique, mineral-heavy pods grown only on the North Ridge. If they could physically recreate the dish to the exact specifications of the 1890s deed annex, they could prove the historical occupancy of the plot. If they failed, the history of the village would be paved over with luxury concrete. Bahram didn't look up immediately, but Nabila saw the muscle in his jaw jump, a rhythmic, violent twitch. He rolled his shoulders, a fine white haze of flour drifting into the air, but his hands, usually so steady, were trembling slightly as he reached for a mixing bowl. He had spent years absorbing the village's grief, acting as the stoic pillar, but the silence he maintained now felt like a dam about to burst. Jovan stepped further into the room, his polished shoes clicking offensively against the rustic floorboards. He looked around the bakery with a thin, dismissive smile, his gaze lingering on the peeling paint and the warmth of the ovens as if he were already surveying a ruin. "Let's be realistic," Jovan continued, his tone shifting to a mock sympathy that felt like a slap. "The resort development brings jobs. It brings infrastructure. It brings a future that doesn't smell like old cinnamon and desperation. I can still offer you a buyout, Bahram, a generous one. Enough to move you and your community somewhere where you aren't fighting a losing battle against a bulldozer." Winta Kebede leaned on her walking stick near the stove, the wood polished smooth from decades of use. Her patient smile remained, but her eyes were flint. "The land remembers who loved it, Mr. Petrov," she said, her voice steady and low, anchoring the room. "And the land does not recognize your buyouts." Jovan's smile vanished, replaced by a look of genuine irritation. He turned his gaze to Nabila, his eyes narrowing. "And you. The librarian. You've spent weeks digging through moldy papers trying to find a loophole that doesn't exist. You're chasing a ghost in a recipe. Do you really think a cake is going to stop a multi-million-dollar development project?" Nabila felt the heat of the ovens at her back and the sudden freezing chill of Jovan's presence. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage, but she forced herself to step forward. "It's not just a cake," she said, her voice cracking slightly before she steadied it. "It's a record. It's the physical proof of the original settlement's boundaries. If we can recreate the specific regional variant described in the deed's annex, the one that requires the specific soil-grown cardamom from the North Ridge, we prove the historical occupancy of this plot. We prove that this land belongs to the people who tended it, not the board that wants to sell it." Jovan let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like breaking glass. A culinary exhibit. How quaint. "I'll be sure to tell the board that the bakery is being held hostage by a dessert." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a hiss, invading her personal space until she could smell the sterile scent of his expensive cologne. "Don't mistake my patience for weakness. If you try to obstruct the filing with some romanticized notion of heritage, I will make sure the library's funding is the first thing to be cut in the new budget. I can erase your archives just as easily as I can flatten this shop." The threat hit Nabila like a physical strike to the solar plexus. She recoiled, her back hitting the edge of the prep table. The library was her sanctuary, the only place where the voices of the lost were still audible. To lose the bakery was a tragedy. To lose the library was an erasure of existence. She felt a wave of nausea roll over her, the stakes suddenly shifting from the professional to the existential. Bahram finally looked up. His eyes were hard, reflecting the amber glow of the oven, but there was a raw, jagged edge to his expression that Nabila had never seen. "Get out, Jovan," he rasped, the words sounding as though they had been dragged through gravel. "The offer stands until tomorrow morning," Jovan replied, stepping back toward the door with a smug, leisurely pace. "After that, the price drops. And the bulldozers get louder." As the door clicked shut behind him, the silence that followed was deafening, heavy with the weight of the ultimatum. The ticking clock on the wall marked each second with a clinical click, counting down the 48 hours remaining. Farhan Malik, who had been standing by the map spread across a flour sack, finally spoke. His voice was clipped, stripped of its usual analytical detachment. "He's trying to rattle us because he knows the land rights records are precarious. My grandmother's case matches the pattern here. The same disputed deeds, the same quiet displacements masked as progress. He isn't just building a resort, he's scrubbing the map clean of anyone who can claim the soil." Farhan's fingers unfolded from their steepled pose to rest flat on the map, as if anchoring himself to the truth of the earth. "I will testify at the hearing. I have the cross-referenced files from the county seat. But Nabila is right. The legal argument is academic without the physical proof. The cake is the anchor. It is Exhibit A. The pressure in the kitchen became almost tactile, a physical weight pressing down on their shoulders. Nabila felt a sudden, visceral rush of urgency that burned through her fear. She reached for the next portion of batter, her movements sharp and decisive. The vulnerability she had felt moments ago transformed into a cold, focused resolve. She looked at Bahram, and for the first time, the friction of their differing methods. Her precision versus his intuition was gone. They were no longer teacher and student. They were soldiers in a trench. "We don't just make it taste good," Nabila said, her voice echoing Farhan's resolve. "We make it undeniable. We follow the recipe to the letter, exactly as the 1890s annex describes it. We prove the ridge cardamom was the staple here. We make it so the board cannot ignore the history it represents." Bahram nodded, his hand brushing hers as he reached for the tin. The contact was brief, but it felt like a pact signed in blood. "Then we don't sleep," he said, his voice low and fierce. "We bake until the evidence is ready." Winta's encouraging smile widened, her presence a steady counterpoint to the accelerating pace of their movements. They worked in a feverish, synchronized rhythm, the kitchen becoming a war room. Nabila measured the seeds with a precision that bordered on the obsessive, her mind racing through the legal implications of every gram, while Bahram managed the heat of the ovens with a protective intensity. As the final tasting began, the flavors bloomed on Nabila's tongue with an unexpected, piercing depth. It wasn't just sweetness. It was the taste of the earth, the salt of the coast, and the bitterness of a century of survival. It tasted like a claim. It tasted like a fight. When they finally stepped away from the bakery to head toward the clerk's office for the final set of documents, the street was bathed in the bruised purple of twilight. Bahram walked beside her, his shoulder occasionally brushing hers, a silent anchor in the storm. They spoke in low tones about the recipe's origin, their voices weaving through the fading light, but Nabila's gaze kept drifting back to the bakery door. She knew that in the dim back rooms of the municipal building, Javan's papers were already stamped and filed. The machinery of the city was moving against them, heavy and indifferent. But as she felt the lingering scent of cardamom on her skin, Nabila realized she was no longer just a librarian reading about the past. She was the one tasked with baking it back into existence, and she would burn every bridge necessary to ensure it survived. Chapter 10. Nabila crossed the threshold of the municipal hearing room with the tray steady in both hands, though her pulse hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cardamom layers remained warm beneath their cloth cover, the scent fighting through the fabric. The air inside the room was stagnant, carrying the sharp metallic tang of old radiators and the sterile scent of floor wax. This was no longer a culinary experiment or a quiet tribute to a lost aunt. The tray was a weapon. The cake was the physical manifestation of a land claim that had been buried for 40 years, the only surviving evidence of a communal trust that predated the current zoning laws. Jovan Petrov did not wait for the proceedings to officially begin. He occupied the podium, his voice cutting through the murmurs with a clinical precision that made Nabila's stomach tighten. He spoke of optimization and urban renewal, his words designed to strip the village of its history and replace it with a series of luxury glass balconies. He wasn't just arguing for a building, he was arguing that the bakery and the cottages surrounding it were obsolete relics, crumbling archives of flour and dust that hindered progress. Nabila set the tray on the side table. As she did, her hand trembled, the metal tray clinking softly against the wood. She felt a sudden, visceral wave of vertigo, the room tilting as Jovan's gaze swept over her dismissive, as if she were a child bringing a snack to a boardroom. She gripped the edge of her apron, the rough weave digging into her palms, anchoring her to the floor. Bahram stood 2 steps behind her. He didn't offer a comforting touch, that wasn't his way, but his presence was a physical wall of support. He had spent the last 3 nights scouring the bakery's oldest ledgers, his eyes bloodshot and his fingers stained with ink, searching for the dates that matched the recipe's margins. He shifted his weight, his boots scuffing the polished floor, a sound that seemed unnervingly loud in the sudden silence. Winta sat on the front bench, her walking stick gripped so tightly her knuckles were white, her gaze fixed on Jovan with a fierce, silent intensity. Farhan, their legal counsel, arranged his notes in clipped stacks, the rustle of paper sounding like a countdown. "This filing closes the loophole," Jovan declared, tapping the stamped pages on the podium. The sound was a gavel strike, final and cold. "The deed is clear. Sentiment is not a legal standing." Nabila reached out and lifted the cloth. The scent erupted, warm, toasted spice and rich butter cutting through the sterile chill of the room. It was a sensory ambush. She saw several villagers in the gallery recoil slightly, not in distaste, but as if they had been struck by a memory they had forgotten how to access. She met Bahram's glance. His jaw was set, but his eyes held the flicker of something raw, a shared desperation. One family's archive fed half these benches last winter, Bahram said, his voice low and gravelly, cutting through Jovan's polished cadence. Efficiency forgets the cardamom, but the land remembers the hands that planted it. Farhan rose then, his voice measured but urgent. He didn't just present a timeline, he launched a challenge. He unrolled a map across the table, the old paper crackling. He pointed to the faded boundaries, showing how they aligned perfectly with the secret notations Nabila had discovered in the recipe's margins. The recipe hadn't been a guide for a cake. It had been a coded map of ownership, a mnemonic device created by a generation that knew the official documents would be stolen or burned. Nabila stepped forward. Her throat felt tight, her voice catching for a second before she forced it out. "My aunt kept the tin dented because it held more than flour," she said, her voice gaining strength, ringing clear through the hall. "It held the proof that this bakery and the surrounding cottages are held in a community trust. The final layer of this cake is the signature of a pact that cannot be overridden by a zoning board." Jovan sneered, his lip curling. "Sentimental folklore," he countered, his voice dripping with a condescension that finally snapped the tension in the room. "We are discussing municipal law, not a bake sale." The reaction was instantaneous. It wasn't a polite disagreement, it was a surge. A fisherman stood up, his voice booming, recounting how the bakery's bread had been the only thing keeping the pier workers alive during the Great Storm of '82. A retired teacher followed, her voice trembling with emotion as she described the bakery as the village's only true sanctuary. The room shifted from a hearing to a reclamation, the air thick with a collective visceral anger. When the panel finally invited a tasting, Bahram took the first piece. He chewed slowly, his eyes closing. For a moment, the stoic mask he wore every day cracked. His shoulders dropped, and a shudder passed through him. A release of the crushing pressure of the debts he had been hiding, the fear that he would be the one to let the bakery die. "This is the note that stayed," he whispered, looking not at the panel, but at Nabila. "It is the taste of a promise kept." Nabila took a piece herself. The cardamom bloomed on her tongue, the warmth triggering a flash of her aunt's kitchen. The smell of old wood, the sound of laughter, the feeling of being safe. The ache of her loss transformed into a sense of purpose. She looked at the board numbers, her gaze unwavering. "If you erase the bakery, you erase the only living record of who we are. You aren't just clearing a lot, you are deleting a people." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Jovan opened his mouth to speak, but the clerk of the board sighed and pushed the stamped pages aside. The official record had been overridden by the living evidence. The panel ruled for preservation. The bakery stayed. Outside, the afternoon light was pale and slanting across cobblestones damp from a morning rain. The air felt lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from the village. Nabila and Bahram walked together, the empty tray between them. Bahram stopped, his hand brushing against hers on the cool metal surface. He didn't pull away. "The next layer will need both of us," he said, his Persian cadence soft, his voice lacking its usual defensive edge. Nabila leaned into him, the victory tasting like the lingering spice on her tongue, sharp, sweet, and finally enduring.